With all the talk of the new space race, all the different participating parties involved in the space race, I'd like to talk about who won the space race and exactly what the space race was about.
We remember, our cleansed memory of that Apollo era is we're explorers, we're Merc, and we go into space.
Yes.
But behind the curtains there, we were scared witless because Russia had been into space first, and they looked like they were beating us in every important way. And so we said, what can we do to make a statement, to make a splash?
Stop.
No pun of it. And that was, let's say we're going to go to the moon.
Because we weren't the first in space.
Yeah, no,
they had
Soviets
Sputnik.
led. Yeah.
They had the first satellite. They had the first non-human animal. They had the first Laika. They had the first human. They had the first woman. They had the first black person, a Cuban. They had the first space station.
This is the race to inhabit space. It all started in 1957 with the launch of Sputnik, and by 1961, Yuri was the first person to have done a full orbit around the Earth. The next month, NASA launched Alan Shepard, but for only 15 minutes in a suborbital flight. Because
space is relatively easy, but orbit is very difficult.
The following year in 1962, John Glenn orbited the Earth 4 times in almost 5 hours. Having caught up to the Russians, they started the Apollo program, which was eager to jump ahead of them, and this ended with tragic results. All of the Apollo missions after that, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, were all unmanned to test various programs like the LIM module. So far, every mission has been to find stable orbit for Apollo and then to test equipment. From here, the only logical step would be then to send men up there to test the equipment, and then the next practical step would be practicing docking in low Earth orbit. Now let's say that Russia just saw that you caught up to them in space. You're now capable of going orbital, and you are working on all of your equipment in hopes that you can now start perfecting docking and potentially start inhabiting or creating structures in space to inhabit space. What do? Well, that's when psychological warfare comes in. What if you told your opponent that your endgame was actually something else, and you convinced them that what you're doing was working towards that something else instead of your actual plan? Well, you would convince them to go ahead and start trying what it is they think you're doing instead of what you're actually doing. So if you're trying to create a space station, and your goal is to find the most perfect orbit in low Earth orbit to start creating structures, then you would convince them that you're going somewhere else. And then maybe, just maybe, they would act on that, diverting their funds, their attention, and everything they're doing to what they think you're doing. And so if you did everything right, they would be convinced that you're going to the moon, and they'd convince their people they're doing that too. The reality is they were actually in low Earth orbit. Apollo 9 and Apollo 10 were there to just test the first lunar module. By 1968 and 69, America and Russia had pretty much caught up with each other. They were working on the same type of crafts, working in the same type of area at about 230 miles up. They had established how to orbit Earth, they had established how to dock with another module, they had established how to potentially inhabit space. All of these missions were not lunar missions, but they were low Earth orbit missions to find that stable orbit, to perfect the equipment, and to get ready to inhabit space with a space station. But Richard Nixon said we were going to go to the moon, and of course that was the most honest administration ever, and so the unfakeable was this.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Both of you want to be able to view the camera from
Yeah, I think something rather important is coming up here.
Neil and Buzz, the President of the United States is in his office now and would like to say a few words to you. Over. That would be an honor. Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House.
The Apollo 11 astronauts received a big, exciting welcome home today from Americans in New York and in Chicago. ABC's Peter Jennings reports on the way it began this morning.
was it we were really celebrating?
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistake.
Despite America's best effort to say that the race was going to the moon, Russia had been working on plans and setting up committees and putting together bureaus to make sure that they could have an international space station in the future. Their first goal was to set in orbit all of the equipment necessary to create a space station to inhabit space. Russia immediately got to work working on low Earth orbit space stations. They shot up the Salyut 1, which was their very first attempted space station program after they had learned how to create stable orbit and had perfected docking. There were several attempts to achieve stable orbit for these space stations. However, it was found that the hardest thing to do in space is to achieve a stable orbit for a long-term space station, and unfortunately all of these came to orbital decay. During that time, America was still saying that it was playing around on the moon, golfing, dune buggies, stuff like that. Well, in reality, it was desperately trying to figure out how to maintain stable orbit and low Earth orbit. Secretly, they had actually been plotting on ways to figure out how to launch their own space station. Although NASA had told the public that the Apollo missions were for going to the moon, the Apollo missions were actually being used to set up a space station in low Earth orbit. They'd been secretly trying with the Russians to put up a space station in low Earth orbit since 1973, once they learned that since 71 the Russians had been potentially inhabiting space. So while we all entertained these magical ideas of golfing, dune buggies on the moon, and how easy it was for all of them to just go there and achieve it with no problems at all, unfortunately the truth was they were scrambling to try to maintain orbit in low Earth orbit and were losing the race to inhabit space. Skylab was ginormous compared to the other stations, and unfortunately that was its Achilles heel. It ended up succumbing to orbital decay because of the amount of drag that it had on it. Skylab only lasted 24 weeks before NASA had realized its mistake and that it was going to end up being decommissioned by the end of the year. Skylab was finally decommissioned in February of 1974. Meanwhile, Russia had been working very hard and put up several more crafts in order to perfect that they were working on from the beginning, a way to inhabit low Earth orbit. They had perfected docking, and now America was interested in working with them. In 1975, although they had convinced the public that the Apollo mission was canceled because there was no more moon missions, the Apollo mission was still very much active and still seeking its original goal, to find stable orbit in low Earth orbit to create a space station for them to inhabit space.
Engine sequence start. 1, 0, launch commit. We have a liftoff. All engines building up.
Meters distance. 3 meters. 3 meters. 13 meters. 1 meter. Contact. Capture. We also have capture. Docking completed.
Docking is completed, Houston. Roger. Well done, Tom. It was a good show. They are looking forward now to second hand with you in both.
Now, neither country actually trusted each other, but they wanted to see what their technologies were and exactly where they were at in space, and this was the best way to test each other's capabilities. Unfortunately, this happened during the height of the Cold War, and the two sides did not end up coming together. In fact, there was more propaganda that ended up being created. To stop America from inhabiting space by continuing the efforts towards making a space station, Russia decided to go ahead and create a couple of Buran space shuttles. Now, these things were never intended to actually fly, but they were intended to make America think it was the next step towards inhabiting space, with the possibility that the Salyut will not be able to inhabit space, and that it will be failing every time that it cannot stay in orbit. America, of course, dove right into this. Our propaganda soared, and we immediately talked about how we're better. Meanwhile, Russia still stuck with their original plan to build a space station in low Earth orbit to inhabit space, and while they were continuously working on that, America ended up perfecting the space shuttle. In April of 1981, NASA launched the very first shuttle mission.
4, we've gone for main engine start. We have main engine start.
Having convinced NASA that it had won, it continued on with their working on a space station. NASA had given up on the idea of a space station, but in the end, Salute 7, perfected, ended up being a 10-year-long, fully functional, successful space station. It even got its own movie. It lasted 10 years and officially was the world's first successful space station. While Russia was now inhabiting space, doing spacewalks, living in space, the shuttle program was not doing as well. In January of 1986, they suffered a catastrophic failure.
Miles an hour, exploded. On the ground, spectators not certain of what they saw.
While NASA was struggling to visit space, Russia had been inhabiting space for over 5 years. The success of the Salyut 7 had showed great potential for another space station, and 5 years into its lifespan, they put up the Mir station. In February of 1986, just after the Challenger explosion, Russia had embarked on one of the biggest and most expensive endeavors of their space programs. The Mir space station was in orbit until 1997, when it was decommissioned to be replaced by the International Space Station. With all the success of the space stations, Russia wanted to make sure that America stayed focused on the program that they had put them towards, and that was the shuttle. So in 1988, Russia launched the shuttle to give America a little bit more focus, thinking they were still working on that. So it's quite obvious that the space race was about inhabiting space. And who was inhabiting space? So it seems obvious the winner of the space race was Russia. Russia being the one who could inhabit space. And that left only one inevitable outcome, and that was America needed to now work with Russia, so America could be inhabiting space. So in 1993, the United States announced that it is going to be partnering with Russia through a new treaty to be a part of the next space station. Which was laughable at best, considering that America had never had a successful space station and still to this day could not inhabit space without Russia and their space station. In November of 1998, after 12 successful years of inhabiting space in the Mir space station and over 17 years inhabiting space in their space stations, Russia agreed to help NASA get in having a space station and put up the very first piece of the International Space Station. This is important because this first piece is what controls it, keeps it in orbit, and has found the stable orbit that NASA has never been able to find, or they would do one themselves. Because lest we not forget,
Space is relatively easy, but orbit is very difficult.
the part of the capsule that they put into orbit was called the Zarya. It was the first piece of the International Space Station and the most important because this is the piece that keeps it in orbit. It is the thing that they needed for Skylab that would have raised and kept it in orbit instead of it falling into the ocean. In December of 1998, NASA launched with the shuttle Endeavour, the second part of the International Space Station. So let's recap. First thing that happened, America in '93 asked if it could be a part of the next Russian space station, and they called it International. They paid for it, and it started happening. In 1994, the construction of it begins in Khrunichev. In 1996, President Clinton and Boris Yeltsin came together to create a new space treaty, which included the ISS development and assembly scheduling. They then named the craft and send it into space, and then America sends its portion to space. NASA experienced another tragedy with the shuttle program in 2003 when the Columbia disintegrated on re-entry. This would inevitably lead to the demise of the Space Shuttle program in August 2011. Now, why would NASA let the Space Shuttle program fall to such decay, to the point where it ended up killing their astronauts? And honestly, the answer is pretty simple, I think. They had a space station, and that was the entire point of the entire space race. By then, NASA had figured out that it had been duped, and the whole point of the shuttle was a trick, and the whole reason for the space race was for a space station inhabiting space.
The Columbia disaster grounded the space shuttle. NASA had no choice but to rely on Russia to transport astronauts to and from the space station. Despite the worldwide collaboration required to build the ISS, China was one of the largest countries not invited to join the International Space Station.
After losing the ability to go to space and the continuous progression of the Chinese space station, the United States Senate created an amendment that made it impossible for the Chinese to use the International Space Station.
Orion is getting ready to launch.
In December of 2014, Orion Trial by Fire was a program that was launched by NASA, and it was Boeing's Orion capsule launched on a Delta Heavy rocket to about 3,600 miles up. The studies that it provided ended up providing a great deal of information to everybody regarding the further regions of space just beyond the International Space Station. It's pretty obvious that the Orion capsule and the entire mission was a replacement for the previous shuttle missions as well as the Apollo missions in the beginning. With this craft and this new mission, it was obvious they were trying to seek stable orbit to create their own space station, so they were not reliant on Russia or China in their new space station.
You are traveling with Orion as the flight test continues. One orbit completed. Time to go. The upper stage of the rocket fires again. Like the setup for a roller coaster ride, this is the big climb we've been waiting for. We are headed 3,600 miles above Earth. 15 times higher from the planet than the International Space Station. As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. For this flight, it's time to head.
At this point, the world started to take notice of the new space race and the competition between China and America and them competing over low Earth orbit and their new potential space stations.
By China to participate in the International Space Station. We invited Russia because they're brilliant people in Russia who were working on space. We don't want them to go to our enemies, whoever they were identified geopolitically at the time. Bring them with us, then they are our allies. And that's why the space station is primarily the United States and Russia and European other nations as well. But the big players were United States and Russia because we had the spacecraft that'll get astronauts to the space station. There's no China. What were the reasons? Oh, human rights violations. It was a political statement of our disapproval of their ways.
Russia didn't have human rights.
I'm just saying, you can't invoke rational thought on a geopolitical landscape. Right. You can only invoke geopolitics. Okay, so I think, I have no evidence for this. Someone somewhere said, if we disinvite China, we know they're gonna do this on their own. And that'll spook us into redoubling our space efforts because now we have a new adversary to replace the Soviet Union, which is the role they played when we went.
It worked perfectly, and NASA started buying up contractors left and right. The first one was Blue Origin, who made a historic rocket landing in 2015, the first one to ever land a rocket after launching it.
Mission and liftoff. Welcome back, New Shepard.
Jeff Bezos and Blue Origins were contracted by NASA to create some of the first lunar lander designs for any of the future lunar missions. However, his contracts were immediately taken back after he had this interview with Michael Collins where he stated that the moon landing was done out of order and that maybe we needed to wait for the technology to catch up.
Is there some way to recapture the U.S. government's interest in this?
Well, I think if you think back to the kind of the heyday of the 1960s and the Apollo program and all of that excitement, my gut instinct on this is that we as a civilization, we as humanity, pulled that moon landing way forward, out of sequence from where it actually should have been. It was a gigantic effort with what is in many ways, it should have been impossible. And they pulled it off with, barely any computational power. They were still using slide rules. They couldn't numerically model in computers a lot of these important processes like combustion inside a rocket engine, which is still hard today, but we can do it a little bit. They didn't have computational fluid dynamics to really, everything had to be done in a wind tunnel. Nothing could be done on a computer. So I think the reason we've sort of taken a hiatus, maybe in part at least, is because we pulled that forward to a time when it should have been impossible. And then once it was done, we kind of had to wait and let technology catch up. The reason that Blue Origin and SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and all these companies today, any of these private companies, the only reason that we can do this kind of endeavor at all is because we're standing on the shoulders of NASA, who invented all of this technology. We're still using all the things that they invented back in the 60s. We have refined versions of it. But even the computer codes that we use to validate our designs have been, honed and fine-tuned by NASA over decades. So this is, I think we're finally entering, I believe that we are entering a new golden age of space and space exploration, and that the time has come for that to happen because we as a species have up-leveled ourselves in terms of technology. We're ready to do it now. It's amazing that we did it in 1969.
So
it's crazy.
So you can imagine when the next month SpaceX did the exact same thing that Blue Origin had just accomplished, NASA decided to go ahead and put its contracts with SpaceX. So with new contractors, NASA was finally ready to start on their very own space station, which they would call the Gateway. So in 2017, NASA created the Artemis mission. Now the purpose of this mission was to go to the moon's south pole, sending people there to core the moon in order to find a way to create fuels to then create crafts to send to Mars. So instead of sending 4 tons of fuel into low Earth orbit and then connecting it to a craft and going to Mars, they think it's better to go to the moon, destroy the moon, hope to find some water, and then use that water to somehow create fuel and then go from there to Mars. Right. When it's pretty obvious that it's just them trying to make another space station.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate that. I don't really need to set the audience. This is a great day. There's a lot of motivation out there. There's a lot of love and support from the families of the turtles. You're gonna hear turtles a lot. That's our class name for these fine 13, and it brings us joy to say that word turtles. So I'll say it a few times.
I like turtles.
It was Mike Pence who named the Artemis crew the Turtles, and it was from this weird tweet it all started. While everyone at NASA tried to figure out exactly what Mike Pence was referring to, it was pretty obvious to those who were paying attention, because the Artemis crew was the Harvey Post Turtles. And anyone who knows what a post turtle is knows that it's a turtle that was put on a post that has no business being there, can't do anything to help anyone, and the person who put him there is an idiot. Which I would say is the absolute best way to describe America's participation in space stations so far.
You confess.
For many years, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has been using Roscosmos to threaten NASA's participation in the International Space Station. However, with the International Space Station coming to its orbital decay point in 2020, Russia and China not working together so well had America working even harder on their space station.
Dangerous standoff in space. Russia is making new threats regarding the safety of an American astronaut on the International Space Station in response to crippling U.S. sanctions.
Прощай, уже вдали встает заря, и день приходит в города. Прощай, под белым небом января мы расстаемся навсегда. Прощай, ничего не обещай и ничего не говори, а чтоб понять мою печаль, стоит вопрос. Смотри, и вдруг погасли две звезды, но лишь теперь понятно мне, что это были я и ты.
And the Caesars all said, "Let the propaganda wars begin."
People have problem on Earth, on orbit. We are like, we are one crew, and I think ISS is like symbol of the friendship and cooperations and like symbol of future of exploration of space. It's like key from Soyuz or another Russian hatches, but it's a like official key of ISS.
While the propaganda said one thing, their actions said another.
NASA already has an agreement with a company called Axiom Space to dock a module to the ISS, along with their own private crew. The idea is that this module will eventually detach and become its own standalone station, even before the ISS is
While they made big claims about what they were going to do or could do, they couldn't actually achieve stable orbit still. Starliner failed, and once again, NASA did not have a way to get to space without Russia. At this point in the new space race, Russia and China could inhabit space, and NASA could not, still.
What's next? Hillary, good morning. Good morning. The new Starliner is currently in the wrong orbit after an error threw the capsule off its original course. Since the launch, NASA has canceled the spacecraft's original mission and is instead focusing on returning it to Earth in the best possible condition.
I'd like to take a moment to talk about the private contractors NASA's been using and the fact that private contractors are nothing new. In fact, NASA has only used private contractors in the past. If you take a look from the beginning of Apollo, you'll see that private contracting is what NASA has done. They don't use the Army Corps engineer. They use companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin and places like that, which are the equivalent to SpaceX and Blue Origin. So with unlimited funding from the United States taxpayer through NASA and the old Apollo launch sites, they finally managed to take two guys, Bob and Doug, and get them in some new SpaceX crafts called the Dragon capsule and launch them to the space station, finally achieving the ability to go into space again without the need to ask Russia or China. And yet still they did not have their own space station or the ability to put one in orbit themselves.
Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. Go NASA, go SpaceX, Godspeed, Bob and Doug.
Each passing day, NASA ended up having more and more reasons to get their own space station and to have their own capsule for mankind.
They have severed their relations on a commercial basis with companies in the West. They have not severed relations with NASA.
At that same time, China had perfected their space station and was now looking to make international partners.
目前，我们拥有完备的
近地载人空间站和载人天地往返运输系统，有成熟的航天员选拔训练和保障体系，有计划明确的载人飞行任务，也就是每年2次常态化实施的载人飞船发射。我们已具备，也做好了邀请国外航天员参与中国空间站飞行任务的准备。借此机会，我们向全世界发出邀请，欢迎所有致力于和平利用外空的国家及地区与我们开展合作，一起参与中国空间站。
So as you can see from the entire history of space from 1957 until now, it has been about the quest for inhabiting space. Who can put up the best space station, who can find with their craft stable orbit, and then replace that craft or add to that craft any substantial amount of weight and keep it there so that they can live in it. It is painfully obvious that Russia won the first space race, and now, at this particular moment, China is winning the second one. Their stations are just much cleaner. They're more efficient in every way. They have the same crafts that come and go that everyone else does, and they're starting to do more types of missions than anyone else has thought of. They've already grown food on their space station. They've already done spacewalks. They have a better arm for grappling. Everything about their system is more progressed and advanced, and we're challenged and scared. Now, if you're wondering why it is that we're fighting over low Earth orbit, why the space station for China and Russia here are only 250 miles up, this is a very simple answer. For the rest of this video, I'm going to explain exactly why it is that we do not leave low Earth orbit or any further than where we are currently at. Neil was correct when he started this off, pointing out that we don't go for exploration purposes. Everything we do is for military purposes. So when they talk about coring the moon to try to go to Mars, to terraform Mars because it's for the better of humanity, to expand humanity because we care about the exploration and goodwill of humans, that's propaganda. That's a bald-faced lie. They're doing it because they're threatened by another nation having the high ground. And where is the high ground? Why is it the high ground?
Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on a run. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. For this flight, it's time to head.
The Artemis 1 launch was equipped with nothing but a couple of mannequins that were completely covered in radiation sensors. This is because of the 2014 launch and a presentation done by GSI that ESA put on.
Radiation, we are all scared of radiation. But radiation in space is heavy ions, iron, these exotic particles, very heavy, very densely ionizing. We say this is a beautiful image that you see. What you see here, this one is a human cell. This is a human nucleus, so you know it's 10 microns approximately, and these two lines that you see here are two iron ions that you don't find in space. I'm sorry, that you find in space but not on Earth, except in Darmstadt, the GSI, where we have it, going through the cells and making damage to the DNA. I was supposed to give ideas here. It looks like, I mean, radiation is a problem. This is clear. Shielding, passive shielding can be a solution on the planet, but not really on transit. Maybe the best solution, the best idea is to use a magnetic shielding, is to build magnetic fields for the spacecrafts that can do what is done on Earth. So it's not really a new idea. It's the same idea that God had a few billions of years ago when he said, okay, I want to make life, but I created radiation already. What can I do now? Okay, maybe I can make a magnetic field, you know? And you see, it's very effective in protecting the Earth and our life from space radiation. Thank you very much.
Marco Durante is a top in his fields in particle physics studies. He works for GSI still and ESA as well. He is one of the reasons why NASA is aware of the current problems they're facing in the Orion launches. They have made countless videos and presentations and published so many articles regarding the problems with radiation, deep space radiation environments, and the lacking of shielding from passive to active shielding currently on our crafts and as well as our spacewalkers.
A critical partnership that not just for Artemis 1, but for the future Artemis missions as well. And that's just the beginning. Thanks to the international collaboration, 3 so-called passengers will fly on Orion. Zohar and Helga, named by the Israel Space Agency and the German Aerospace Center, are 2 female mannequins. Their jobs are to provide data on radiation levels during the mission. The 3rd passenger is a male mannequin whose name was decided by more than 300,000 people in a naming contest. And his name is Commander Moonikin.
Disregarding the fact that the first Orion launched in 2014, this Orion launch, called Artemis, now considered the first launch of Orion, did not launch the first time. In fact, it took 4 times. Mostly because they couldn't seem to transfer hydrogen, which makes it difficult to believe they're going to core the moon for ice and then turn that ice into fuel and then transfer the fuel on the moon through tanks to other crafts and then launch from the moon when they can't even do it here on Earth. So obviously this thing is launching and going where the last mission went in hopes that they can find stable orbit to put that space station there. But clearly they have to worry about higher levels of radiation in that orbit.
The upper stage of the rocket fires again. Like the setup for a roller coaster ride, this is the big climb we've been waiting for. We are headed 3,600 miles above Earth, 15 times higher from the planet than the International Space Station.
After spending $26 billion on one launch that took 4 attempts to just find out that we're not ready for the radiation levels that are up there, that our equipment is failing, and then to find out that once again the heat shielding did not hold up, Artemis found themselves delayed.
Floor to Administrator Bill Nelson.
Hey everybody, it was a little over a year ago that all of us watched Artemis 1 as a test flight, and it was so successful that additional tests were added in the course. It went further than any human-rated spacecraft, and it has that iconic picture that we've all seen where it's taking a selfie photograph of itself, and in the background, 40,000 miles away, is the moon, and further in the background, 270 miles away, is our planet.
A Freudian slip by an old man who's giving away where they're actually at? Because at 270 miles, they would have to deal with a little bit more radiation.
How we go is just as important as what we do. And so, this is, to put it in the president's terms, this is a big deal. We've announced a new partnership with the UAE for Gateway, and that's a huge moment for the future of space exploration. And through CLIPS and crewed Artemis missions, we are showing the strength of the commercial partnerships and American innovation. We are doing something incredibly different. In the process of all this, as we remind everybody at every turn, safety is our top priority. And to give Artemis teams more time to work through the challenges with first-time developments, operations, and integration, we're going to give more time on Artemis 2 and 3. So what I want to tell you is we are adjusting our schedule to target Artemis 2 for September of 2025 and September of 2026 for Artemis 3, which will send humans for the first time to the lunar South Pole. Artemis 4 remains on track for September 2028.
So now I'm going to explain one more time why we're only 250 miles up, fighting over low Earth orbit, and not going further out. This is where we are in space right now. This little red dot represents pretty much the entirety of human presence and everything that we've put in space. This first little ring of layering kind of represents the thermosphere, and underneath it would be, the mesosphere, then our stratosphere and our troposphere, but right above that, the second ring, that's the exosphere. That's the last remaining shreds of our atmosphere. Over the past 60 years, there's been a lot of talk about the Van Allen belts. Well, I would like to talk more about the magnetosphere. Specifically, I would like to talk about the magnetosheath, which is probably the most important part of the magnetosphere and far greater in radiation than the Van Allen belts themselves. Now, the function of the magnetosheath is to use that solid line at the end of it there, that is the bow shock, to deflect the majority of radiation from space. About 99.99% of the radiation that comes from the sun gets deflected by that surface right there. The magnetosheath is comprised of pure plasma. It's ionizing radiation at its deadliest. The Van Allen belts are fed the radiation they have through polar cusps, that when the magnetosheath gets too much ionizing radiation, when the bow shock lets a little bit too much through, electromagnetic reconnection happens through neutral points which feed the radiation through the polar cusps into the Van Allen belts. So if you were to fly through the Van Allen belts, through the magnetosheath, and then into deep space, you would be flying into the depths and the majority of radiation that we don't have here on Earth.
Scientists have been trying to learn why this crisscrossing of magnetic field lines, called magnetic reconnection, triggers such a violent explosion, opening the rifts into the magnetosphere. NASA's Magnetospheric Multiscale Mission
I was supposed to give ideas here. It looks like, radiation is a problem. This is clear. Shielding, passive shielding, can be a solution on the planet, but not really on transit. Maybe the best solution, the best idea, is to use a magnetic shield, is to build magnetic fields for the spacecrafts that can do what is done on Earth. So it's not really a new idea. It's the same idea that God had a few billions of years ago when he said, okay, I want to make life, but I created radiation already. What can I do now? Okay, maybe I can make a magnetic field.
Is that the magnetic fields are blocking some portion of the solar wind from reaching the surface.
The solar wind is the sun's continuous outflow of particles and radiation that fills the inner solar system. Earth's magnetic field provides a strong global shield against it. However, the magnetic field on the moon is much weaker, and it forms only small, localized bubbles of protection. In these spots, the sun's particles can be reflected back into the solar wind or funneled to nearby regions. The shielded areas under the magnetic field form pale swirls. Those bordering parts become darker. The contrast is so prominent, we can actually see it from Earth.
The magnetic fields in some region are locally acting as this magnetic sunscreen. You know, sometimes you put on sunscreen and you miss like a tiny little bit, and then you have a really bright red spot on your skin where you missed it. That's in some ways the analogy of this sort of region of the moon that is extra exposed.
Unfortunately, the moon's patches of magnetic field are not robust enough to completely protect human explorers from the sun's radiation. But further study of lunar magnetic fields could lay the groundwork for future innovations.
Well, what if we got a strong enough magnetic field that perhaps we could produce artificially? That's a question that I think remains to be answered, but the crustal magnetic fields on the moon and lunar swirls kind of provide a hint in that direction that we might be able to learn something about.
Radiation is an ever-present hazard in space travel, and it's one of the few environmental factors that crew will be exposed to that has a potential long-term health impact. I'm Nick Stoffel. I'm a physicist and professional engineer, science and operations lead for the LETS payload. The Linear Energy Transfer Spectrometer is a small, low-power radiation detector based on time-fixed technology developed at CERN. It's similar to devices that we've flown on ISS and Artemis. The science we're expecting to get from the LETS detector is take that information and translate it from deposited energy in silicon, which is what we measure with this detector, into a more biologically equivalent value that we can utilize for crew protection. One of the key pieces, I think, that if we can capture would be outstanding is getting data from a radiation event, a solar storm on the moon, while crew are not there. That would be ideal from the standpoint of being able to get the data without putting crew at risk, and then utilizing that data to prepare for crew protection during the lunar operations. I started my career with NASA at the Space Radiation Analysis Group, working with detectors and training for ISS and shuttle missions. In addition, this detector that forms the core of the LETS, the time-fixed technology, has been a focus of my work for quite a while. So being able to see that data from the lunar surface is going to be amazing. Commercial lunar payload services. NASA and American companies working together.
Future of space. A space company will hope to land on the moon the next time it gets a chance. That moon lander suffered a fuel leak after it successfully launched. Now News 6's James Barbero has an update on the mission failure just in time for the next high-profile launch set up on the Space Coast.
So on the eve of the first astronaut launch of the year, that's the fully private Axiom Mission 3 on the countdown clock now, we're also closing in on the abrupt ending of a major uncrewed mission. Last week, I was in this location recording the first launch of the new Vulcan Centaur from United Launch Alliance, carrying the first commercial spacecraft ever to launch on a mission to the moon. The Peregrine from Astrobotic would have been the first American spacecraft to land on the moon since Apollo 17, but within hours after launch, Astrobotic reported the fuel leak that would ultimately doom the landing attempt, and now the company reports it expects Peregrine to burn up in Earth's atmosphere on Thursday.
It's incredibly exciting. This is 16 years in the making. And
despite the anticipated loss of his spacecraft, John Thornton, the CEO of Astrobotic, who I interviewed before the launch, is still crediting his employees for their resiliency working through the adversity of the last week. Astrobotic says it extended the life of Peregrine several days longer than expected after the fuel leak, and some of the science experiments on board were even able to go online. Another space journalist who covered the launch of Vulcan and Peregrine, Bill Harwood, space expert from CBS News. Bill, of course, with the moon landing ultimately being a failure, how important is it that Astrobotic still has the support from NASA? NASA saying that once Astrobotic can try again, they've got their full support.
Absolutely. You know, this is a critical program to NASA's Artemis moon program. That's the program to land astronauts back on the moon. NASA's counting on these small commercial landers to kind of pave the way. So they're all in.
It's quite obvious that it's not a lunar lander, it's a radiation probe to test the environment that is just above the previous orbit the space stations were at for the new orbit that they're trying to find to put their new space station gateway. Obviously, if you took away the Earth and you just made the picture there, the moon, those circles they're doing around the moon, that's actually what the probe's doing around the Earth right now. So there you have it, everything that they've done from 1957 to now, and it's failed. Even their radiation sensor this last week, it's over for them. So who really won the space race? Out of all of what you were just shown, all of what they've done, it was clearly all an attempt to just inhabit space with a space station, craft after craft, trying to get into an orbit that didn't fall down, didn't blow up, didn't catastrophically fail. So there you have it. There's the real space race, and the real space race today, and the reason why they're actually doing it. I hope this helped you guys understand it.